The city was a sprawling, indifferent beast, but in this one corner, on the fourth floor of a pre-war brownstone, a profound silence had settled, thick and cold as dust. Elias Thorne, a man whose life revolved around the chemical scent of linseed oil and the careful repair of centuries of decay, had just inherited that silence. He wasn't a family member. He was simply the executor for the late Mr. Alistair Finch, a recluse painter who had passed away alone, his existence evaporating like smoke. Elias was here to catalog the estate, specifically the art. A job that promised nothing more than tedious paperwork and the smell of formaldehyde. Mixed with turpentine, the apartment itself was an anachronism. Dark wood paneling swallowed the weak afternoon light, and heavy velvet drapes guarded the windows like sentinels. Every room felt too large, the air too still. The silence, Elias noticed immediately, was not merely an absence of noise. It was an active, oppressive presence, like a blanket smothering sound itself. Finch had been a man dedicated to the quiet pursuit of the image, and his home was a shrine to that deadly dedication. Elias moved into the studio. The largest room, which was dominated by a massive, untouched easel shrouded in a white linen sheet. The room was a chaos of color and dried paint, yet it possessed a dreadful order, as if Finch had been interrupted mid-stroke by something sudden and final. Elias set down his briefcase, the soft clack of the latches sounding like a gunshot in the mausoleum-like atmosphere. His eyes were immediately drawn to the easel. He approached it slowly, the floorboards groaning a protest beneath his weight. There was something magnetic about the shape beneath the cloth, an unnatural tension held within the folds of the fabric. With a professional, detached air that was his armor against the world, he reached out and grasped the edge of the sheet. He pulled it away. The canvas beneath was large, easily 5 by 7 feet, and utterly terrifying. It was a portrait, but not of a person. It was a half-finished study of a woman, rendered with brutal, unflinching realism. Her skin was a pallid, moonlit white, contrasting sharply with the deep, shadow-drenched background. She had been painted with a visceral intensity that was disturbing, but it was the eyes that stopped Elias cold. They were complete, luminous, and fixed. They weren't merely painted eyes. They held a moist, observing quality, a wet intelligence that seemed to pierce the distance and hold him in a tight, psychological grip. The effect was immediate and nauseating. The woman in the canvas was terrified, and those eyes seemed to plead for help. Elias, a man accustomed to the passive beauty and slumbering history of old art, felt a tremor of genuine, irrational fear. Finch hadn't just painted a portrait. He had captured a raw, enduring moment of profound distress. He checked his notes. The previous tenant, a young, vibrant woman named Clara Vance, had vanished from the building 6 months prior. The police considered it a runaway case, though the superintendent had hinted at something darker, something Finch had known. He stepped back, shaking off the sudden chill. This was merely art hyper-realism pushed to a psychological extreme. But as he turned to retrieve his equipment, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh of moving air, originating from the canvas. He spun around. The portrait was still. The eyes still watched. But the thin layer of dust that had been undisturbed on the easel's base now showed a delicate, almost invisible disturbance, as if a breath of air had just passed over it. He spent the next hour documenting the painting, refusing to look directly into the subject's face, focusing instead on the unfinished elements. Finch's technique was baffling. It wasn't just oil. There were layers of material that looked organic, almost like dried skin or hair woven into the deepest shades of the background. It was grotesque. He labeled it the Vance portrait and marked it for immediate removal and appraisal, kneading it out of the oppressive space. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows through the high windows. Elias noticed a tiny, almost invisible detail at the very edge of the portrait's wooden frame, where the canvas met the wood. A minute smear of red, not the bright, vibrant red of a pigment, but the deep, ferrous red of dried, oxidized blood. He leaned closer, his chest tight. It was a single tiny fleck, yet its presence changed the entire atmosphere of the room. This wasn't just an art project. This was a crime scene, or perhaps something far more perverse. The dread intensified, gripping his throat. He had to know the source. He carefully scraped a microsample, placing it into a sterile vial. That night, Elias tried to sleep in the guest room, a dark, small box away from the studio. But the air was too heavy, the silence too absolute. He kept seeing the woman's eyes in the dark, luminous and pleading. Around 3 a.m., a sound cut through the silence. It was a high, thin shudder, like a violin string vibrating inside a confined space, and it repeated, faintly, rhythmically. It sounded like the low, almost subsonic pulse of a heartbeat, coming from the direction of the studio. He lay still, drenched in cold sweat, his professional skepticism warring with the raw, animal instincts screaming at him to flee. He had a duty to the estate. He had to be sure. He grabbed his heavy, antique flashlight and walked back to the studio, the beam cutting a weak, yellow tunnel through the suffocating darkness. The heartbeat sound grew louder, no longer a pulse, but a muffled thumping, as if something large and heavy was moving very slowly against a cloth barrier. Elias reached the easel. The thumping was undeniably coming from the canvas itself. He raised the light, illuminating the horrible portrait. In the beam, the skin tone of the subject, the spectral, pallid white, looked fractionally warmer, and the eyes, still watching, seemed to possess a renewed, terrifying wetness. He could see a faint, internal movement in the deepest shadows of the background, as if the darkness was shifting, reforming. He knew, with a dreadful certainty that bypassed reason, that the woman's terror was not a painted emotion. It was a live, trapped fear, and the soul of Clara Vance was not run away, but was perpetually, silently screaming from within the final layers of Finch's twisted creation. Elias stood paralyzed, the light trembling in his hand, listening to the suffocating thumps of a heart that was beating inside a painting. He had to be quiet, had to wait, because the darkness in the studio had noticed him. If you're captivated by the silent terror trapped within this canvas, please consider subscribing to Night World. Your support keeps the darkness alive. The thumping faded with the first hesitant light of dawn receding into the deep, dead stillness of the apartment. Elias stood until the sun was fully up, his breathing shallow, the terror giving way to a cold, scientific resolve. He was no longer an executor. He was a detective standing at the edge of an impossible, horrifying mystery. He had to understand the composition of the portrait, the layers, the strange, organic elements he'd noted the day before. He carefully transported the microsample of the red substance and the tiny flecks of canvas material back to his small, sterile restoration lab located elsewhere in the city. The contrast between Finch's dark, suffocating apartment and his own brightly lit, clinically organized workspace was a necessary psychological shield. Under the powerful magnification of his microscope, the results were immediate and staggering. The red fleck was confirmed. Type O human blood, heavily concentrated and aged, but undeniably blood. The fibers of the deepest layer of the paint were even more disturbing. They weren't linen or cotton, but highly processed. Organic keratin, human hair, and fingernail fragments ground to an almost microscopic powder and mixed with the oil. Finch hadn't just painted. He had entombed his subject, mixing her very being into his palette. Elias researched Alistair Finch's history. Finch was not a famous painter, but a profoundly private, extremely wealthy amateur who had purchased and restored antique furniture and old master frames for decades. He was a master of antique wood preservation and structural integrity. This detail, seemingly innocuous, resonated with a new, awful clarity. Finch was not just preserving an image. He was preserving a vessel. Elias returned to the brownstone that afternoon, armed not with a flashlight, but with chemical testing kits and a small, powerful endoscope used for inspecting cracks in ancient frescoes. The studio was colder than before, the air vibrating with a nervous energy that seemed to emanate from the portrait itself. He focused on the frame. It was an antique Dutch frame, thick and heavy, but upon close inspection, Elias realized Finch had done extensive work on it. Using the endoscope, he discovered minute channels carved into the wooden backing, too precise for simple wiring. They were circulation channels, connecting the edges of the canvas support to a small, nearly invisible wooden box Finch had recessed into the wall directly behind the painting. With a crowbar and surgical precision, Elias pried the box from the wall. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry moss and desiccated herbs, was a collection of archaic, unsettling objects: a dried, shriveled flower, a small, tarnished silver locket containing a lock of light brown hair Clara Vance's color, and most chillingly, a sealed glass vial containing a pale, viscous liquid that looked like a mixture of milk and ash. This entire arrangement, Elias concluded, was a custodial mechanism, a macabre life support system for a captured soul. As he was documenting the contents of the box, his hand brushed against the back of a canvas support. He felt a faint residual heat, not the heat of a radiator or a lamp, but something internal and living. He placed his hand flat against the wood. Beneath his palm, he felt a definite, slow, but unmistakable vibration, a deep internal hum that made the bones in his hand ache. It was the same rhythm as the heartbeat he had heard in the night, only now it was continuous, a constant, low-frequency signal of trapped life. He carefully scraped a sample of the dried moss from the box, analyzing it later back at his lab. It contained trace amounts of a powerful, long-acting sedative one that would induce a near catatonic state in a living human. The sickening truth crystallized. Finch hadn't just murdered Clara Vance. He had sedated her, bound her essence, and mixed her into the paint, layer by terrible layer, preserving her terror for all time, trapping her soul within the physical dimensions of the canvas and its frame. That evening, a terrible compulsion took hold of Elias. He couldn't leave the painting alone. He sat in the studio, a bottle of expensive solvent beside him, staring at the luminous, pleading eyes. He wanted to use the solvent to dissolve the paint, to release the soul. But a dark, insidious whisper of professional curiosity held him back. What would happen if he truly understood the mechanism? What if he could communicate? As darkness fell, the sound in the studio changed. The low vibration and the faint thumping persisted, but now a new sound began to filter through the silence. It was a faint, almost inaudible chattering, like teeth rapidly clicking together, originating from the center of the canvas. Elias approached, placing his ear against the edge of the frame. The chattering intensified, becoming a desperate, muffled sound. It was the woman, Clara Vance, trapped in a silent, permanent state of shock, her essence trying to communicate the unbearable cold and fear. Elias had to make a choice. He could walk away, call the police, and let them destroy this impossible horror. Or he could stay and attempt the unthinkable, an interaction with a soul entombed in pigment. The eyes in the portrait were staring at him, and for the first time, they didn't look nearly terrified. They looked like they were begging a final, desperate question. Don't miss the next chapter of this dark obsession. Hit the subscribe button and join the Night World community for more chilling stories. Asterisk. Elias's professional caution had curdled into a dangerous, dark obsession. He chose to stay. He knew the police would see only a gruesome masterpiece and dismiss his claims of a trapped soul as a psychological breakdown. He needed proof, and Clara Vance needed an advocate. His goals shifted from simply documenting the crime to achieving a dialogue with the painted flesh. His expertise in restoration gave him a unique, terrifying advantage. He knew the weakest points of a canvas, the chemical reactivity of old oils, and the structural integrity of the frame. He reasoned that Finch had to have created a minuscule point of interaction, a channel for the soul's energy to maintain contact with the outside world. A point where the vessel was most porous. He set up a battery of sensitive instruments. Around the easel, a parabolic microphone to capture high-frequency sounds, a thermal camera to detect minute changes in temperature, and a delicate sensor to measure micro vibrations in the wood. He killed all the apartment lights and sat vigil in the pitch-black studio, relying on the faint, ambient street glow and the electronic flicker of his instruments. Asterisk. The thermal camera provided the first chilling confirmation. In the spectral heat signatures, the area corresponding to the woman's mouth and hands on the canvas registered a temperature consistently 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than the surrounding surface. It was a point of active cold transference, a location where the inner, frozen environment of the painting was leaching into the room, a sign of constant, desperate energy expenditure. He aimed the parabolic microphone at the mouth area. For hours, there was only static, the low hum of the environment. Then around midnight, a faint sound broke through. It wasn't the chattering, but a whisper, so faint it sounded like dried leaves skittering across pavement. Elias boosted the gain, the sound crackling with static, yet the intent was clear. A single strained word repeated over and over, cold. The sheer horror of hearing an actual, recognizable word from within the painting almost broke him. This wasn't a haunting. It was a vicious, ongoing imprisonment, and the woman's consciousness was fully intact. She was experiencing the absolute sensory deprivation and the physical decay of the painting's materials. Elias began to speak to the canvas, his voice low and steady. "Clara, I know you're in there. I'm Elias. I'm trying to help you. Did Finch do this?" The response was immediate and terrifying. The image seemed to jolt, a minuscule internal ripple, visible only in the extreme realism of the painted face. The whispered word changed, becoming sharper, more frantic. Frame, frame, frame. The frame, Elias thought. The wooden, channeled antique frame that Finch had modified. That was the mechanism, the physical connection, the jail cell itself. He needed to understand how to disarm it without destroying the captured essence, without destroying Clara. He looked at the portrait's hands, which were rendered in a partial clench near the bottom of the canvas. Following the thermal anomaly, he directed a powerful focus beam of UV light across that area. Under the UV, the oil paint layers of the hands, though perfectly finished, fluoresced differently. They seemed thinner, more translucent. In the center of the painted palm, a patch of paint, barely a centimeter in diameter, was almost completely transparent under the UV, a carefully hidden thin spot, a window. Elias had to act. He had no more time for documentation. He fetched a fine-tipped needle, one used for injecting microscopic amounts of binder into fragile canvases. He approached the painting, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands steady with the adrenaline of absolute terror. He was about to physically puncture the boundary between worlds. He placed the needle's tip against the thin spot on the painted palm. As the metal touched the oil, the entire room seemed to dim. The vibration from the frame intensified into a palpable, deep thrum. The woman's painted eyes in the portrait were now wide, filled with a mixture of hope and renewed, unbearable agony. Elias pushed the needle through. There was no rip of canvas, only a soft, sickening squelch, followed by a rush of cold, foul-smelling air. A single drop of thick, dark fluid, the color of old wine, welled up from the pinprick in the canvas and ran down the painted hand. It was not paint. It was the custodial essence of the captured soul. The moment the fluid touched the air, the rhythmic thrumming in the frame stopped dead. The studio plunged into an absolute chilling silence. He had broken the seal. The question now was, what exactly had he released? Asterisk, the silence that followed the puncture was worse than any noise. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The portrait of Clara Vance looked different now. The hyperrealism was gone. The colors looked dull, flat, and lifeless, and the light in her eyes had been extinguished. She was no longer watching. She was just paint on canvas, a beautiful, horrible image. Elias felt a wave of crushing guilt, believing he had accidentally extinguished her soul. He leaned against the easel, trying to process the catastrophic silence when he heard a new, chilling sound. It wasn't from the portrait. It was a low, guttural, slithering sound coming from the shadowed corner of the studio, near the door. He spun around, grabbing his heavy brass case magnifying glass for defense. The parabolic microphone, still on its tripod, began to shriek with a sudden, overwhelming rush of white noise. Through the white noise, a dark, raspy voice sliced through, a sound like dried parchment scraping over gravel. It was Finch's voice, and it was filled with absolute rage. The voice seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the room, condemning Elias for his interference. The voice promised a similar fate, to be preserved, layer by layer, in an eternal living portrait of his own terror. The darkness in the corner intensified, coalescing into a shimmering, indistinct form. Elias understood now. Alistair Finch had successfully preserved more than one life essence. By puncturing the painting and releasing Clara's soul from its custody, he had caused an imbalance in the spiritual mechanics of the apartment, and the darkness Finch's own preserved essence, or perhaps the demonic intelligence that guided him, was now free to claim a new vessel. His eyes darted back to the easel. The portrait of Clara Vance was indeed lifeless, but the puncture hole he made was slowly, sickeningly, closing itself, the canvas fibers drawing back together, the thick, dark fluid he had released being absorbed back into the paint. The portrait was self-healing. Finch's vessel was trying to reset, to re-entrap the soul he had briefly freed. Elias realized his mistake. He hadn't just broken a seal. He had triggered a reabsorption protocol. He needed to destroy the painting entirely, to permanently shatter the vessel before the spirit of Clara Vance was re-imprisoned, and before Finch's dark essence could fully materialize. He reached for the solvent, a powerful industrial-grade acetone that could dissolve layers of oil paint in seconds. He uncapped the bottle, the acrid fumes instantly filling the heavy air. The slithering shadow in the corner lunged, suddenly solidifying into a translucent, humanoid shape, thin and elongated, its hands ending in impossibly long, dripping brushes. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the largest bottle of solvent and hurled it at the apparition. The acetone exploded on impact, not burning the entity, but causing the air around it to shimmer and retract. As if the chemical was disrupting the very medium it used to materialize, he turned back to the portrait, pouring the rest of the solvent directly onto the canvas, focusing on the terrible, lifelike eyes. The acetone instantly began to work its corrosive magic. The oil paint bubbled, cracked, and melted, the hyper-realistic skin tone dissolving into a sickly, multicolored sludge. The face of Clara Vance began to run, her pleading expression warping into a silent, liquid scream dot as the face dissolved. A faint, pure light emanated from the canvas, a brief, blinding flash of white that filled the entire studio. The slithering darkness in the corner shrieked, a sound of agony and absolute defeat, and vanished completely. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the apartment lifted instantly, replaced by the normal, slightly dusty air of an old building. The sounds of the city, a distant siren, a car horn rushed in, No longer muffled, Elias stood shaking, the empty solvent bottle slipping from his numb fingers. The portrait of Clara Vance was gone, replaced by a canvas of wet, ruined sludge. The silence was finally, truly, just an absence of sound. He had destroyed the vessel, and in doing so, he had freed the soul. He found one final item on the floor near the destroyed easel, something he had knocked down during the struggle. It was a small, elegantly carved wooden palette used by Finch for mixing his gruesome materials. Etched into the wood, covered in centuries of dried paint, was a single, cryptic symbol, a perfect circle with a vertical line through its center. The signature of an ancient preservation ritual. Elias didn't call the police. He simply cataloged the remaining innocent art, packed his belongings, and left the apartment forever. He knew the police wouldn't believe the true story, and he knew that somewhere, in another dark old building, another collector of essences was using that same circular symbol to preserve their own living masterpiece. He had broken one chain, but the dark art of the archivist remained. This is the end of Elias Thorne's harrowing journey. If this cinematic terror held you captive, please subscribe to Night World. We'll be waiting for you in the next shadow. Elias returned to his own queen. Orderly lab, but the meticulous calm of his surroundings no longer held the same reassuring power. The stench of acetone and the memory of the light and the screeching shadow lingered like an infection. He was physically and psychologically drained, yet his restored mind couldn't let go of the single, most tangible piece of evidence, the empty, modified wooden frame. He had left the ruined canvas behind, but he had brought the frame with him. It was a dense, heavy structure, now utterly silent, its internal channels no longer thrumming. He dissected it with the same surgical precision he used on priceless antiquities, his hands now moving with a grim, almost ritualistic purpose. He uncovered Finch's secrets layer by layer. The internal circulation channels he had noted before were not for simple wiring, but were lined with a porous, copper-infused clay and sealed with a shellac mixed with pulverized bone. This material, Elias theorized, was a massive, highly efficient conductor designed to draw subtle energy, the soul essence from the canvas, stabilize it, and then subtly recirculate it back into the paint layers, ensuring the portrait's horrific lifelike perpetuity. Finch had created a closed-loop system for spiritual containment in the deepest recesses of the top rail of the frame. Elias found a minuscule hinged compartment, carefully concealed beneath a dark wood inlay. Inside, there was a single rolled-up piece of vellum parchment, brittle with age, covered in Finch's cramped, elegant handwriting. The vellum contained not a confession, but a journal entry detailing Finch's twisted philosophy. He referred to his victims not as people, but as luminaries beings whose essence was too vibrant to simply die. He wrote of the human soul as a form of hyperstable pigment that, when properly bound with certain organic stabilizers, the blood, hair, and nail fragments, could be made permanent, transcending the temporary decay of the body. He called the process the archival of self and the painting the eternity vessel. The entry climaxed with a chilling, philosophical statement: the finished painting is merely a mirror. The true art is the living, breathing moment of terror preserved within the paint. It is a moment of pure, raw consciousness, captured and displayed for the eye of God. Finch saw himself not as a murderer, but as a preservationist, ensuring his victim's consciousness remained active and suffering forever. Elias also discovered a second, far more disturbing entry, a recipe. It was a step-by-step instruction for the preparation of a new vessel, complete with diagrams of the copper clay lining and the precise chemical mixtures needed to create the binding agent. The final critical ingredient for this new vessel was chillingly simple: a piece of the old frame. The material, having successfully contained a soul, was considered inoculated, and essential for the next ritual. The frame itself was not just a container. It was a spiritual virus designed to propagate Finch's dark art. Elias had been right to take the frame. Had he left it, another collector, or perhaps Finch's ethereal essence, could have salvaged it to continue the horrifying work. He couldn't just throw it away. The risk of its finding its way into the wrong hands, or perhaps even the risk of it still being an active conduit, was too great. As he worked, a new detail about Finch's movements began to gnaw at him. Finch had been a recluse, but Elias knew from the building superintendent that the painter had occasionally received cryptic, late-night deliveries, small wooden crates, delivered by a man with no discernible uniform or affiliation. These crates, Elias now suspected, contained the archaic ritual components: the copper-infused clay, the bone powder, the specialized vellum. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Finch was not an isolated lunatic. He was part of a network. The symbol etched on the palette, the circle with the vertical line, was not a personal signature, but a dark sigil, an insignia of a hidden society of archivist artists dedicated to this horrific form of preservation. He looked down at the frame, lying dissected on his sterile workbench. It was an object of immense darkness, a testament to pure clinical evil. He knew his only recourse was total destruction, not just dissolution, but erasure. He planned to burn the components, grind the copper clay to dust, and then scatter the ashes in a river. He had broken one link in a chain that was longer and darker than he could possibly imagine, and now he had to destroy the evidence that the link ever existed. Keep your lights on and your doors locked. If you're invested in uncovering the world's deepest, darkest secrets, smash that subscribe button for more cinematic terror from Night World. Asterisk. Elias's plan to destroy the frame was interrupted by a knock on his lab door, a sharp, insistent rap that was entirely out of place in his quiet industrial building. His heart immediately seized up. No one ever visited his lab unannounced. He looked through the security peephole. Standing outside was a tall, perfectly dressed man in a dark, bespoke suit. The man's face was utterly expressionless, his eyes flat and dark. In his hand, he held a sleek, black briefcase and nothing else. The man was a profound presence of stillness, an architect of silence. Elias didn't open the door. He simply asked, "Who are you?" The voice that came through the thick wood was low, smooth, and chillingly devoid of inflection. "My name is Marius. I represent the final affairs of Alistair Finch. I am here to collect the remaining estate component." The vessel frame. Elias realized this was one of the delivery men, the silent couriers of the archivist's network. The network had been alerted to the destruction of Finch's masterpiece and the subsequent removal of the frame, the crucial, inoculated component. They were not waiting for the police or the courts. They were coming for their property. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elias lied, his voice tight. He knew this man was not a lawyer. He was a cleaner. Marius's voice remained perfectly calm. "Mr. Thorne, you are a professional. You understand preservation. We understand your desire to dissect the mechanism. It is commendable. But the frame is not merely an object. It is a conduit. You have breached the confinement and released a soul. That energy must be accounted for. We are not here to harm you, only to collect the component and restore the balance of silence." The phrase "balance of silence" echoed Finch's journal. It was a euphemism for the continued suffering of a trapped soul, a state of perpetual quiet fear. Elias looked down at the disassembled frame on his bench. It was too late to run. He had to destroy the frame now. He grabbed a heavy industrial sledgehammer, an item rarely used in the delicate art of restoration, but necessary now for blunt, final force. "You can't have it," Elias said, loud enough for Marius to hear. He raised the sledgehammer high above his head and brought it down with all his desperate strength onto the thickest, most complex part of the frame, the section containing the copper clay lining, and the hidden journal dot. The wood didn't simply crack. It exploded in a burst of dry splinters and a fine dust-like powder of copper clay. A strange, resonant sound, like a bell being struck deep underwater, emanated from the fragmented wood, and a ripple of energy, visible only as a slight shimmer in the air, passed through the room. On the other side of the door, Marius let out a single soundless gasp of pure, utter shock. Elias struck again and again, pulverizing the wood, ensuring every piece of the conductive clay was reduced to a useless, inert powder. He was not just destroying a frame. He was dismantling a ritual circuit, shattering the last tangible link to the horror of Alistair Finch. When he stopped, breathing heavily, the door remained silent. He looked through the peephole again. Marius was gone. There was no trace of him, not even a shadow in the hallway. Elias had won, but he knew the victory was provisional. He had earned the animosity of an entire network of dark archivist artists. He had shattered their most prized piece of ritual technology. He spent the next 3 days methodically grinding the remains of the frame into dust, mixing the powder with concrete and burying it in separate locations across the city. He never spoke of the Vance portrait again. His life returned to a semblance of normal, but the professional restorer, the man of calm, detached focus, was gone. He looked at every antique, every old piece of furniture, and every oil painting with a new, terrifying suspicion. He saw the potential for the eternity vessel everywhere. He had learned the true, dark meaning of preservation, that sometimes the most merciful act is to let things die. He understood the circle and line sigil now. It was not a symbol of preservation, but a mark of ownership over the infinite, a claim on the unending torment of a captured human soul. Elias Thorne continued his work, but his world was permanently darker, haunted by the knowledge that in the quiet corners of the world, there were architects of silence who built the frames that breathed, waiting for the next vibrant soul to be collected and rendered permanent, all for the sake of the most terrifying art of all dot. This is the chilling end to the neighbor's unfinished portrait. If you were trapped in the suspense of this cinematic narrative, do us a favor, hit the like button, share this terror, and make sure you're subscribed to Night World for the next terrifying tale. Good night.